Weapons. Every country needs them, but not many can make them. Weapons contracts have always been a major tool in geopolitics. Whole alliances can be constructed around them. Every country has at least some security concerns, but very few have the industrial base or technical knowledge to design and make their own. So if you're a country that doesn't have those things, you need to buy your weapons from one of the major international suppliers. But who you pick can have major ramifications, intersecting economies, ideology, and geography. Of your buffet of options, who are your choices? The United States is by far the largest arms exporter in the world, almost more than the rest of the world combined. The United States is often the first pick for many countries' weapons deals, since America has by far the most developed defense industry and is decades ahead of most of its rivals. America historically has been very willing to sell arms to almost anyone, barring a country directly challenging U.S. interests, and even then there were some exceptions. Many countries use buying American weapons as a way to buy their way into a relationship with the US and NATO, but this is increasingly difficult as time goes on. You can't pick and choose which American weapons you would like these days. When you buy American, at least the high-end stuff, you're buying an entire supply chain. You can't simply buy an F-35, you need to buy spare parts, modernized airfield facilities, and fly all your pilots out to America for training since the simulators aren't allowed to be exported. And while you're at it, may as well make the most of your purchase and get some tanker and cargo planes too, right? And at that point, it's just easier and cheaper to standardize your whole army around US and NATO standards, locking you into one supplier. And it's not like this stuff is cheap. Most arms deals with the US start in the triple-digit millions. The only small deals the US makes anymore are resupplying and upgrading old systems. Buying American is a huge investment for any country, and often leads to a long-term dependence on American suppliers. Depending on the country, this is either a great path forward or a deal with the devil. The US, a little counterintuitively, is one of the less concerned countries about things like ideology or other alignments when selling weapons. The US, for all of its bluster about freedom and democracy, is more than happy to prop up incredibly oppressive regimes such as Saudi Arabia or Egypt for its own benefit. The weapons industry in America is huge, and will leverage its lobbying power for something that would be good for business. This creates a divide in American weapons sales policy that scares some countries away. On one hand, you have the defense industry that's more than willing to sell the weapons as long as it's profitable for them, and the US government that wants to attach a bunch of strings to the deal. And that isn't even taking into account the major shift in US policy that usually happens every 4 to 8 years or so. American policy in the last 20 years or so has ranged from laser focusing on anything a country in the market for weapons might be up to not talking to you at all, thinking tweeting something makes it policy, and being gridlocked and nothing ever happens. So America, the best of the best, unbelievably expensive, sometimes unreliable, but still one of the best friends you can have in this era. Behind the US, Russia is the next biggest arms exporter. Most military equipment around the world is either American or Russian/Soviet derived, and it's for a good reason. Russia invests huge amounts of human capital in its arms industry, and is able to get the most bang for the buck because of it. Russian weapons might not be the most cutting edge, but they are durable, versatile, and extremely cost-effective. Russia produces a small amount of types that are able to fill many roles, further stretching what a buyer can get out of them. But that small number of types does limit customers. If you want to buy Russian, you have to accept all the flaws that their currently produced models have, and Russia doesn't have an alternative to sell you. Russia is one of the most eager countries to make weapons deals, since the country tends to have unreliable sources of foreign currency compared to other weapons exporters. Russia is also sometimes willing to make non-cash deals, making them more appealing to poorer countries. Russia is extremely reluctant to sell the good stuff. They instead mostly export what are pejoratively called monkey models. These are models that have downgrades compared to what the Russian army makes for itself. Things like variants with poor night vision systems, weak ammunition, bad avionics, and outdated computers. Probably the most famous monkey model was the MiG-23E variant, sold to Soviet allies in the Middle East. Only one country really successfully negotiated a purchase of the real stuff, and that took some tenacious negotiating. If you're a prospective buyer, it's difficult to trust Russia with that sort of history, but they still have customers because of the flexibility of their contracts. Russia will sell in any amount you want, from the smallest Peruvian truck order to the biggest Indian submarine contract. Of course, there are also geopolitical implications of buying Russian stuff. The Russian sphere of influence is very vague, and the constituent countries often have completely misaligned goals and ideologies. Western sellers are very reluctant to sell to any country in that sphere, however. A recent example is Turkey being kicked out of the F-35 program for buying the S-400 air defense system from Russia. Since the war in the Ukraine started, Russia has become a weapons importer rather than exporter. Russian arms exports dropped by 70% after the war started. Russia's foreign imported munitions aren't things like advanced systems or planes, but rather things like artillery shells, which are somewhat time-consuming and expensive to produce in large amounts. So, Russia. Flexible, cheap, but not the best around. China is a fairly new player in the arms trade. For about 80 years, China's defense industry consisted of buying foreign-made weapons. Until an extensive modernization program in the 80s, Chinese military doctrine focused nearly completely on infantry, and little funding went towards other programs. During the Cold War, Chinese arms exports consisted of domestically made copies of Soviet equipment, sold mostly to African countries, and the occasional sale to a friend in Asia. China carved a decent niche for itself as a reliable partner willing to cut a deal, with a knack for dodging, or usually simply ignoring, sanctions. China has historically been able to do large amounts of research, but due to logistical issues with raw materials, and internal political disagreements, couldn't turn these into anything practical. China has still had some recent difficulties bringing the latest technologies from the lab to the factory floor. For their J-20 stealth fighter, they're still needing to import engines from Russia, and this engine has been around for over 15 years now. China used to be very aggressive in marketing its weapons abroad, mostly to help fund research and development domestically. Chinese weapons are very unique, as China has drawn technology from many countries around the world to make its own versions at home. China even produces weapons that are up to NATO standards, specifically for export. The syncretic mix of East and West makes China uniquely versatile in the arms industry, incorporating the best of both worlds. The durability and cheapness of the East, with the advanced technologies of the West, allow for China to cater to very specific tastes. With China's economic boom in the late 80s to late 2010s, China's weapons exports have become less of an economic matter as much as a strategic one. China has become more picky about who it does business with, and very much wants an ongoing relationship beyond a one-off weapons deal. A good example is the recent partnership with Pakistan. Pakistan is in a fantastic position to challenge one of China's chief regional rivals, India. China could have simply sold some low-tech basic weapons to Pakistan, which would have probably made their way into the hands of anti-India insurgents in fairly short order, but China is thinking longer term than that. China worked with Pakistan to develop a modern plane tailored to Pakistan's particular needs, aka just good enough to shoot down Indian MiGs. China also helped open the deep-water port at Gwadar, located in a very strategic point near India and the Strait of Hormuz. This project has been attacked by local Balochi insurgents, who coincidentally also happen to like causing trouble in Iran, too. I wonder who could be behind all of that. A pretty major downside of Chinese weapons is that China, like Russia, also won't export weapons made for its own military. China also hasn't fought a serious war since the 50s, so there is basically zero data about how effective Chinese arms are. China is exceptionally concerned about ideology compared to Russia and the United States. That ideology isn't communism or whatever you could call China today, but a strange sort of third-way, almost neo-non-aligned movement characterized by anti-Americanism. It's not so much as wanting countries to align with them, as it is discouraging them to align with the West. So, China. Simultaneously low-tech and advanced, predictable, and often with ulterior motives. I'm lumping a bunch of countries together here, but European defense policy has been largely uniform since World War II. European governments are loath to spend any of their national budgets on defense, and this is reflected in the state of their arms industries. European weapons can be characterized as technologically advanced, but expensive to both buy and maintain, and often with very specialized features. European countries can often barely afford to buy their own equipment when development is done. Despite this, the European Union altogether is second in global arms exports. France alone exports as much as Russia. This is really more because of the dedicated effort from European companies such as Airbus, Saab, Thales, Krupp, BAE, and many more, rather than national policies of European countries. European products are superbly cutting edge on a global scale, and for certain niches are the best or sometimes only option. But this advancement requires substantial research and upfront cost, which is reflected in the price tag. It's no coincidence that the only buyers outside of Europe are places like rich Gulf states, countries that want to reverse engineer them, or countries with no other options. It doesn't help that European weapons are only getting more expensive since the bloc seems committed to shooting themselves in the foot by deindustrializing. But this doesn't even get into the political mess of European weapons. Many European defense companies have merged into these strange, semi-international mutant conglomerates, making export controls a mess. Europe generally isn't all that concerned about ideology, more so broader European goals like human rights or economic development. Human rights, sure. European weapons are often thrown in as freebies in economic deals, leading to their proliferation around the world, particularly during the Cold War. Again, this all varies a lot by which European country you want to talk about, but these are the broad strokes. So, Europe. Advanced, very expensive, and with a Kafkaesque bureaucracy attached. There's a lot more countries that export arms, of course, but those are the big guys. India, Israel, both Koreas, Turkey, Japan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and even Australia and New Zealand all deserve a mention. The international market is a fascinating place, even more so when you focus in on the things designed to kill people. Whichever supplier or country chooses, you can bet they'll get something that spits a lot of lead and makes their enemies a whole lot deader.
You have reached the 651 area code test number in St. Paul, Minnesota for the Minneapolis LATA 628.